Good day, everyone. My name is LVG Grande, and in this episode, I'm going to be giving a reading of Monavia's lecture that they presented for the NS Roleplay Symposium 2020. So let's get this started. The lecture is entitled, Some Brief Remarks on Roleplay Etiquette and Decorum. Introduction. All games have rules and standards that exist for the benefit of their players. Role-playing games, including nation-states, are inherently cooperative exercises, so they are only fun to play as long as cooperation is possible between their participants. Since a commitment to good decorum helps foster this cooperation by creating and maintaining a sportsmanlike atmosphere, I want to use this lecture to highlight some critical ways in which role-players can work together to make their participation in this game more pleasant and productive in the future. Throughout the time I have spent preparing this lecture, I have often leaned on the expertise of others, standing on the shoulders of giants, as the saying goes, to refresh my understanding of some of the topics I want to cover. I am also particularly indebted to Gant for inviting me to join the NS Roleplay Symposium staff and reserving space on the symposium's agenda for me to present information on this topic. Basic principles of roleplay conduct. Nation-states has no shortage of rules, as the one-stop rules shop can easily demonstrate, but the whole lot of them stands upon the foundational principle of civility, which holds that players should behave fairly and courteously towards one another. One of the basic principles of roleplay etiquette is the concept that roleplayers are entitled to decide what happens to their own in-character stuff, within reason, and that it is therefore bad form for one roleplayer to arbitrarily and capriciously decide what happens to another roleplayer's stuff without his or her consent. Another is the concept that roleplayers should not allow in-universe things to affect their relationship with real life, or vice versa. Other basic principles include avoiding out-of-character provocations, getting along with the moderators, resolving disputes over in-character details in a civil manner, and demonstrating a willingness to lose. I have dedicated the next few sections of this lecture to explaining how each of these principles function and offering some tips you can use to adhere to them in practice. Separating out-of-character things from in-character things. Most roleplayers tend to have difficulty role-playing with someone who does not play well with others, for a number of obvious reasons. This is especially true in cases where roleplayers forget that their nation-states' nations and characters are entirely fictitious, and therefore the things that happen to them ought not to be construed as somehow reflecting on the out-of-character merits of the players. While nation-states was originally designed for teens and players who are new to role-playing, especially in the youngest age brackets, and might need some practice at learning how to fully understand this distinction, an inability to distinguish reality from fiction is, at bottom, a sign of immaturity that others will notice. If you are new to role-playing, please make a point of learning how to understand this distinction before you throw yourself headfirst into the role-play scene. You will save yourself a lot of potential trouble. Over the 15 years I have played nation-states, I have witnessed many cases in which role-players take in-character matters personally in a wide variety of ways that cannot be regarded as civil or healthy. These episodes tend to spark out-of-character disputes that end in fractured relationships and moderators stepping in to mete out warnings and bans. In many cases, the parties to these disputes did themselves, and each other, no favors by arguing in bad faith. For example, engaging in name-calling, impugning one another's motives, and so on. Or by failing to call for help from moderation or other role-players with more experience. When facing disputes of this nature, the best thing to do is to lower the temperature by avoiding heated rhetoric and expressing a willingness to call for help. While it is better to avoid these disputes altogether, if you are an experienced role-player who is trying to teach a newbie the basic principles of role-playing for the first time, an abundance of patience and politeness will carry you far in teaching your new roleplay partner how to understand and appreciate the out-of-character and in-character distinction. Even if you do not have any trouble separating reality from fiction on an intellectual level, there is still one roleplay habit that can lead you to blur the line between them without intending to do so. This habit, which is known as metagaming, typically consists of one or more characters knowing things in universe that they should not be able to know. To state my main point another way, your characters do not know all the things about the story they are in that you know as an author of that story. If I write a post stating that one of my named characters secretly broke into a safe and left behind 0 evidence that could be used to determine his or her identity in universe, then the other roleplayers in that thread should not write posts stating that their characters know who the culprit is, just because the writers behind them know who that person is. Metagaming thus violates the separation of fiction from reality and should therefore be avoided. Avoiding out-of-character provocations. As important as it is for roleplayers to maintain clear boundaries between roleplay and real life, it is equally important that they remember that the out-of-character side of nation-states is just as dependent on civility as any other part of real life is. Just as it is important to go about insulting... Just as it is improper to go about insulting and harassing people in public, it is bad form. In fact, it is illegal under nation-state site rules to flame, troll, bait, harass, or otherwise provoke other members of the roleplay community. In fact, malicious provocation is a surefire way you can wear out your welcome to the point that the moderators end up deleting your account. Even without intending to provoke another roleplayer, there are a number of ways you can inadvertently get under someone else's skin in a way that might be construed as provocative. One example is the use of abrasive language towards roleplayers in an out-of-character thread. Another example is going about assuming that other roleplayers are acting in bad faith and treating them accordingly. A third example is disregarding the rules established by the person hosting an in-character thread. Generally speaking, a lack of thoughtful consideration for the interests of others can be almost as offensive as actual rudeness, so it behooves you, as a roleplayer, to act politely towards your host, honor his or her desired role-playing rules, and request rule changes in a measured, respectful fashion if you do not agree with them. Always assume that other roleplayers are acting in good faith unless you can prove otherwise, and avoid taking abrasive commentary too personally. Never accuse someone else of god-modding, power gaming, metagaming, flaming, trolling, or violating site rules without believable evidence. Threaten to use moderators as your personal attack dogs when someone disagrees with you, or try to one-up another roleplayer at rules lawyering. In short, if a certain form of behavior appears likely to alienate someone else, it is probably not something you should try. Getting along with the moderators. The moderator team exists to help the nation-state's community function in a healthy and constructive fashion by enforcing the rules of the game and offering players assistance and direction as requests arise. Because moderators devote considerable amounts of time to keeping the site running smoothly and often have to muster a lot of patience when picking through player disputes, common decency entitles them to a certain measure of respect from the rest of the community. It is therefore incumbent on all nation-states roleplayers to make good faith efforts to get along with the moderation team as best they can. Just as you should try to avoid provoking other roleplayers, you should not treat the moderation team in any way that might lead them to assume you are just a troublemaker, spoiling for a fight. Other than violating the site's terms of service and impersonating a moderator, there are a few ways you can put yourself on moderation's naughty list faster than throwing a tantrum in response to a moderator ruling, especially when discipline is being meted out. If you have reason to believe that a moderator ruling is unfair, you can always follow the appeal procedure that the nation-state's site rules contain. If you have reason to believe that a moderator has engaged in any form of misconduct, the site rules contain instructions for requesting an investigation. Regardless of how you feel about a moderator's actions, you should never accuse a moderator of acting tyrannically, whip up a virtual mob to push for a moderator's firing or resignation, or try using the forums to litigate moderation disputes in the court of public opinion. Posting rants about mod tyranny will make you look like a whiner, and claiming someone's account got unjustly deleted will win you few friends, because nobody gets deleted without wearing out his or her welcome first. Again, if you have issues with something a moderator does, there are officially sanctioned channels you can use to obtain proper redress. Handling disputes over in-character details. Roleplayers will not always see eye to eye, even when they are fully committed to working together. Every roleplayer approaches a roleplay thread from his or her unique individual perspective, which personal experiences tend to shape in a very big way. So it is very important that every roleplayer participating in that thread have an understanding of and an appreciation for the perspectives of the others to keep the roleplay thread healthy. This means that roleplayers who enter a thread should be transparently candid about the roleplay goals they want to achieve through their participation, and entertain a willingness to discuss and settle on some out-of-character rules they can agree to honor over the course of their participation. In practice, this means that nation-states roleplayers who want to join an in-character thread need to acquaint themselves with the thread's details and recognize and honor the basic roleplay goals specified by the in-character thread's host or hosts. As in a real-life social gathering, it is incumbent on the host to spell out the sort of details that the guests need to know. Such details can include limits on the number of participants who should be allowed to enter, the thread's desired genre and story format, the time period in which the story is to be set, the sort of magic system that is canon for that particular thread, and whether the in-character thread's story is supposed to be driven by its characters, in-character events, or both. I have witnessed numerous cases in which roleplayers hosting in-character threads fail to specify the social and canonical boundaries they want other participants to respect, only to end up scrambling to make new rules as they go along in response to out-of-character disputes that arise after the threads are well underway. One of the best things roleplayers can do to avoid disputes over in-character details is to discuss details that can materially impact the direction of a story's plot before setting those details in stone. For instance, I might want to roleplay a duel between one of my characters and a character controlled by another roleplayer. I assume that both characters agreed to dueling terms that allow them to wear armor, while the other roleplayer assumes that both will be fighting unarmored. And we both make several roleplay posts before I mentioned that the other player's character failed to wound my character because my character is wearing armor. The other player might post, "Hey, wait a minute, you can't say the duelists could wear armor in this thread. I was under the impression that we were both going to fight unarmored." In this scenario, both of us would be at fault for failing to bring up the subject during the planning phase of the roleplay and getting this matter hammered out before finding ourselves with a dozen posts to discuss and then retroactively edit. I have seen many roleplay threads crash and burn through out-of-character disputes resulting from roleplayers making roleplay decisions based on differing assumptions they did not disclose to the other roleplayers in those threads. History has shown that clear, consistent, and direct communication is an excellent preventative measure, as is a willingness to stop and ask for directions whenever a roleplayer is trying to take a thread in a direction you do not fully understand. There is also much value in inviting a disinterested third party to mediate disagreements. In fact, the ability to mediate is one thing mentors look for when recruiting new mentors. Willingness to lose. Most roleplayers tend to dislike seeing their nations and characters lose at things because the logical consequences of defeat tend to curtail the range of things they can do with their settings and characters in universe. This is especially true anytime your nation-state's nation gets destroyed by a war, plague, depression, or natural disaster, since these sorts of things tend to leave nations in poor shape for throwing their weight around in universe for a long span of time. The same basic principle applies to cases in which you lose a major character or institution or concept in which you have invested significant amounts of time and creative effort. Losing can often come with major in-character downsides, but a willingness to lose can also gain you a number of out-of-character benefits. As Krieg's Guide to Losing explains in greater detail, a willingness to lose demonstrates good sportsmanship and will therefore earn you respect as a roleplayer. It will also help you keep your ego from getting sucked into an obsession with winning at all costs. Losing can enable you to explore a number of new role-playing options that you would not have any reasons to explore if your nations, characters, and so on consistently wanted everything. For example, a story about a defeated nation rebuilding and rearming can be just as fun to write, and as fun for your audience to read, as a story about a nation achieving glorious triumphs on the battlefield. You are, of course, free to do whatever you like within your nation-state's nations when you get into a losing conflict. Nevertheless, retconning your way out of a loss is regarded as the easy way out for a reason. It is equally possible for you to get your nation-state's nation out of a bind the hard way by role-playing its recovery, even if that means retiring old, established characters and having to create a new generation of characters that carry your nation's story forward. From a creative perspective, it is a more fulfilling way to address the in-character loss because it gives you a way to incorporate it into your canon. From a sportsmanship perspective, it shows that you are willing to honor all the time that others spent building a shared in-character history with you through role-playing with them. Avoiding god modding and power gaming. There are many different practices that tend to detrimentally affect roleplay threads and thereby discourage other roleplayers from wanting to roleplay with you. In addition to bad habits that, like provoking other players and failing to distinguish OOC stuff from IC stuff, there are other forms of roleplay behavior that will often cause other roleplayers a great deal of annoyance. These forms of unsportsmanship-like behavior include godmodding and power gaming, both of which you ought to avoid. Godmodding, a practice in which roleplayers try to give their stuff unfair advantages, typically comes in 5 main forms. Firstly, saying what happens to another roleplayer's stuff. Secondly, declaring your own stuff invincible. Thirdly, refusing to accept any losses without cause. Fourthly, metagaming on purpose. And lastly, using selective retcons to undo events, especially losses, that you and your roleplay partners agreed to accept. These practices are known as godmodding because they perform the same function as god mode cheat codes in video games. If you want to read about godmodding in further detail, Euroslavia's comprehensive treatise on godmodding is your best friend. While godmodding is considered bad form because it explicitly violates nation-states roleplay rules, power gaming is considered bad form even though it does not technically violate anything except the roleplay community's standards of decency. Power gaming is the practice of role-playing with other roleplayers in a way designed to guarantee the others will always lose. One major example is using an established nation account to roleplay the conquest of nations belonging to new players who roleplay with NS stats, thus putting them at an inherent disadvantage, and then claiming to own hundreds of colonies when going up against another established roleplayer. While power gaming is not technically illegal, it is tasteless, immature, and petty enough to constitute of a form of bad roleplay etiquette and therefore should be avoided. Approaching potential roleplay partners. The process of finding new roleplay partners in the nation-states community can often resemble the process of finding new friends and acquaintances in a social setting. Sometimes we are lucky enough to run into people with similar interests by dint of favorable circumstances, but this is not always the case. If you find yourself wanting to partner with someone new for a roleplay thread, you need to develop a constructive way of approaching that person and pitching the ideas you have in mind. In most cases, the two principal ways in which one roleplayer gets in touch with another are telegrams and posting in out-of-character threads. Off-site means of communication, such as instant messaging services, can also offer you a means of contacting someone about a roleplay idea. When contacting a stranger using the telegram feature, you should make a point of introducing yourself up front before explaining what you are hoping to achieve. Once you have established your identity with the other person, your next main task is to lay out the rudiments of your roleplay proposal while inviting the other person to offer feedback. This last bit is critical, as the person you want to contact might be interested in roleplaying something with you, but just not in the exact way that you might have been contemplating. An openness towards haggling and negotiating various details will help nurture a potential collaborative relationship, as will inviting the other player or the other party to ask you questions and offering prompt, straight answers. When approaching other roleplayers through out-of-character threads, you need to be open and transparent about your intentions after you have introduced yourself. If you want to jump on an open roleplay threads bandwagon, you are likelier to garner a warm reception if you take some time to introduce yourself, when applicable, and explain your reasons for wanting to join and stating the objectives that you are hoping to achieve. For instance, if you want your nation-states nation to join a roleplay thread about a civil war tearing apart another our peer's nation, you should disclose which side your nation is backing and why. If one of your RP objectives is to roleplay your country's merchants selling weapons to both sides, or one of your politicians flying in at random to play the hero and broker a truce, it is generally wise to share this information with the thread's IC host, with the in-character thread's host, so he or she can work with you to accommodate your entry. If you want to join an organized roleplay community, such as a dedicated RP region or role-playing association, you need to find out which ones will be a good fit for you before you formally join any of them. The best way to do this is to approach individual members of these communities and ask them insightful questions about what their communities are like, why they joined, and so forth. You can learn a lot about a roleplay community just by communicating with a few individual members. You are not obligated to go through the trouble of putting in a membership application, getting vetted, and proving yourself worthy to join a community unless you have solid reasons to join it in the first place. If you do not have any good reasons to join a specific RP community, or you believe the potential cons of joining outweigh the potential pros, you can always politely decline to join without having any bridges to burn in the process. Conclusion. Civility and decorum are vital components of any cooperative enterprise, including the nation-states roleplay scene. So a proper respect for roleplay etiquette will help you gain new friends and avoid acrimonious disputes whenever you get into a disagreement. Most of this site's rules stand upon a single golden rule: behave towards others as you would prefer to have them behave towards you. If you keep this point at the forefront of your interactions with others, you should be able to get along well with the nation-states roleplay community as a whole. I sincerely hope that the advice I am able to offer in this lecture will prove helpful to those who have found it worth their time to attend it. Thank you.